For the last couple of Octobers, I've intended to make a video where I take classic horror movie characters and turn them into superheroes, and it's always just either slipped my mind or lost out to another idea, so this year I figured I would start October right off with that very episode. Specifically taking horror movie characters and turning them into superheroes in the Marvel Universe. Now, technically one of the creatures I'm using for this episode isn't quite as iconic as some of the others. It's the Gwoemul from the Korean horror movie The Host, but if you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend checking it out. It's directed by the guy who did Snowpiercer and Parasite, and it's my personal favorite monster movie. It has some top tier monster stuff in it. But even if you've never seen it before, I think you'll enjoy the story and art for it, because it was a very fun and easy one to adapt. So let's get into it, shall we? Let's go. Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. For many millennia, the alien races of the Kree and the Skrulls have been at war. Both sides have devised innumerable tactics to try and gain the upper hand, even biological engineering. 300 years ago, a long-since-dead Kree scientist called Gygar went so far as to develop and breed a whole new species, built to be an intelligent and lethal weapon for the Kree armies. He spent years constructing them on the distant and nearly abandoned Kree moon of Acheron, working in secret, as not all his methods would have been agreeable to his superiors. His plan was simply to go to them with his results when he was finished, knowing they'd eventually see his means were justified. The creatures he made were a blend of multiple alien species, predominantly bred from the genes of the Kree, the Brood, and the Outriders. This new species, which he called the Xenomorphs, had enhanced speed, strength, durability, agility, powerful blade-tipped tails and claws, and impeccable hunting senses. Not to mention acidic blood, so if they were injured in battle, their death could still bring about the end of their opponents. They became exactly as deadly as Gygar had hoped, but they were not as cooperative as he'd intended. He'd bred one of the subjects larger and stronger than the others, intending her to be the leader of the first hive. He called her Xeno, and when she was alive and in her early tests, she started asking questions of her creator. Her main inquiry was why her and her kind should be brought into a millennia-old war that Gygar didn't even seem to recall why it had begun in the first place. Gygar gave no satisfactory answers, simply claiming that her and her kind were his creation and must do as he commanded. This, of course, was far from a satisfactory answer, and soon enough Xeno took charge of her newly created people and turned against Gygar. They killed their creator and took this moon for their home. Over the next 3 centuries, they bred and their numbers grew to nearly 1,000. They developed their own small civilization, led by Xeno, who eventually had a daughter of her own, named Eloise, that she intended to have take her place as leader of the hive. Though, she wouldn't get the chance. After living in peace on Acheron for some time, the species was eventually discovered by a Kree warrior called Ripley, the Accuser. She came to the moon with a small crew, unaware of what they'd find on this long-since abandoned territory, and the Xenomorphs attacked, in a desire to keep other Kree from learning of their existence. In the process of the battle, Ripley's entire squadron was slain, but she found her own way to the nest in which the Xenomorphs laid their eggs of their young, and she threatened to burn them all unless they allowed her to escape. Xeno reluctantly agreed, and they all prepared for another battle upon Ripley the Accuser's return. But no battle was to come. What came instead was a slaughter. Ripley returned with dozens of ships that lit up the moon with fire from afar. By the time she came to the surface, clad in golden Kree mech armor, few remained aside from Xeno and Eloise. Xeno tried her best to protect what little was left of her people, but she was slain by the Accuser. Eloise was taken into Kree custody, as were the dozen or so remaining of her kind. The rest had all accepted defeat and the fate that awaited them on the Kree homeworld, but Eloise knew that she had to take over her mother's charge. She just barely managed to escape the Kree and fled in one of their own ships, swearing to return for her people when she found allies willing to aid her in the task of saving and protecting them until they found a new home. And luckily, After some weeks of searching, she'd find a group of scrappy guardians perfectly suited to the task. In the Florida Everglades, there rests a swamp with unusual abilities. Some select few know it as the place that transformed poor Dr. Theodore Salas into the infamous Man-Thing. But he is not the only one to undergo transformation in these waters. A young boy named Jason Voorhees once attended an ill-funded camp that stood on the edge of these swamps. It wasn't well run, and the counselors cared little about keeping the young attendees safe. On top of that, Jason had a very difficult time making any friends due to his shy demeanor and his appearance. He had a disfigured head due to being born with an ailment called hydrocephalus. He'd also, sadly, learned to always keep quiet, as any time he spoke up at home, it would often result in his abusive stepfather hurting him or his mother. His mother loved him dearly and had sent him away to the camp, hoping it could make for a good summer experience. But that was far from the case. He was bullied by both campers and counselors, and spent much of his time alone. In much of his free time, he'd sit out on the dock, feet dangling in the water, crying and confessing his wishes to the swamp. He said he wanted it all to stop. He didn't want to be afraid at home or alone everywhere he went. He wanted to look normal, or at least be able to stand up for himself, to be bigger and stronger. Saying this aloud was simply his own attempt at coping. But little did he know, the swamp was listening. The water around his ankles suddenly swirled and shifted into hands and grabbed his ankles. He was pulled down into the water. He thrashed and called for help, but the counselors, who were supposed to be on watch, were nowhere to be seen. Jason was eventually pulled under and blacked out. Strangely, he felt at peace when the waters fully overtook him. All was dark, but all was calm. Jason thought he had died, and this still nothingness was simply the afterlife. But eventually, his eyes opened. He swam himself to the swamp's surface and quickly got to shore. As he emerged from the water, still confused and scared by what had occurred, he got a glimpse down at his own body, and thought for a moment he'd gone mad. He was at least 2 feet taller and had the muscles of a bodybuilder. He touched his head and face, then looked down at his own reflection in the water. Not only did he look nearly 10 years older, but his hydrocephalus was gone. His head was totally normal in shape. While he was baffled by this transformation, he also eventually noticed that it was nighttime. When he'd gone under, it had been day. There must have been people out looking for him. He ran towards the main cabin, moving far faster than any normal human could. He felt strong, remarkably strong, and suddenly got to imagine himself in his new form, hitting back hard at those who caused him such pain in life. But through these thoughts, he also slowly started to notice how run down the camp around him looked. The main building door was off its hinges, and when he walked inside, he saw all the furniture was gone, and all that remained was some kind of tribute in the middle of the room. There were photographs of his counselors, long-dead flowers, burnt-out candles, and a plaque that read, "You will be remembered." Eventually, Jason would discover the full and tragic story. The reason he looked older was because he was older. He'd been in those swamps for 13 years. The camp thought he'd died, and his body had been lost. When his mother learned this, and learned that Jason had been having a hard time at camp, and that he'd allegedly died from negligence due to the counselors, she'd gone mad and massacred them. Eventually, one had gotten an upper hand and killed her with a machete. Jason was mortified, both that his mother was dead, but also what she'd done in his name. While part of him certainly wanted those who'd hurt him to get a taste of their own medicine, them dying served nobody any good, and only caused more suffering for the loved ones of those who had died. In a way, that day Jason had been left with nothing, save for his painful and dark past. But he decided that he wouldn't let that decide how bright his future could be, especially with these new gifts granted to him by the swamp. He took on a new name and got a job as a counselor for struggling children. Whenever he got insights that a parent or person were tormenting a child in need, he'd don an intimidating suit, somewhat hobbled together from hockey pads, and go strike fear into the assailant, roughing them up and warning them against any further ill acts, especially against children. This became his life for a few years, but it wasn't long before he got on S.H.I.E.L.D.'s radar, and was approached to see if he'd be willing to use his skills to counter some of the world's larger threats. Quick interruption here to give a congratulations to the winners of the recent PopCross HQ Discord event, Pop Sona Party, where participants had to design their own variant version of the PopCross Studios icon. The event was run by Unknown Specimen, who picked one of the sets of winners, and now I'm here to pick another set. There was a lot of cool stuff sent in, but I had to narrow it down to just two, so my two favorites were Muse Wolfloids and Basil of the Leaves. I really like the art and the lore that was submitted along with them, and if you want to participate in events like this, the mods of the PopCross Discord are always running cool stuff like it, so click the link to the Discord down in the description. It's a really fun place to be, and we're both partnered and verified. But anyway, back into more art. The Roxxon Energy Corporation has a long history of corporate misconduct and malpractice, and yet they always find a way to stay in business and booming. When they opened a new base of operations in Seoul, South Korea, many should have been keeping a close eye on them, and yet they were able to pay off the right people to keep their heads turned away. The company was using this new facility to try and develop a new form of energy, made from Terrigen crystals, the same substance that awakened superhuman abilities in Inhumans. Of course, what they were doing to it made it a toxic, hazardous sludge, and to dispose of their failed experiments, they simply dumped the waste right into the Han River. This went unnoticed by most, but not by a young man whose prying eyes were out seeking a story. Nam-il was an aspiring reporter and activist who'd been trying to figure out what misdeeds Roxxon was up to since they'd started operations in Korea. He'd finally discovered a way to sneak into the Roxxon facility, but needed a lookout. He managed to wrangle his sister, Namju, into coming with him in a particularly low moment, as she'd just choked for the second time in a national archery competition, and needed some kind of win, even if it was simply helping her brother with what she thought was a fool's errand. He also made her swear not to tell their father or other younger sister what they were up to, and she reluctantly agreed, thinking nothing would come of this whole ordeal anyhow. She went with him and waited in a dark corner while her brother snuck in through a back doorway with a busted lock. She waited for half an hour before growing anxious and going in after him. She searched through the main floor, then down into a sub-basement, feeling nauseous from the smell. Soon after, she found her brother and wished she'd come in sooner. He was tied to a chair in front of a large pipe full of flowing green sludge. He was beaten half to death with 3 men around him interrogating him as to why he'd snuck into this facility. Namju was horrified, but knew this wasn't a situation where she could afford to choke, so she did the only thing she could think to do. She ran at her brother, bolting past the 3 shocked men, and tackled Nam-il and the chair over into the pipe behind. They slid down and splashed into 2 feet of murky, foul water that streamed out into the Han River. Namju vomited due to the foul odor coming from the sludge that covered her and her brother, but then quickly got to untying him. But by the time he was untied, it was too late. Nam-il had died from his injuries. Namju was shaking from anger and shock. Or at least she thought. Her body shook more and more rapidly until she fell over and was thrashing in the foul, mucky water. As she lay there shaking, 5 men in hazmat suits slid down the pipe after her. They approached her and she wanted nothing more than to fight or run, but her body wasn't cooperating. Until it did in a very unexpected way. Suddenly, a tail sprang from beneath her and slammed into one of the men, hurling him to his back. She soon realized that this tail was coming from her, and her shaking had stopped. She flung herself to her feet with a balletic leap, looking at her hands and seeing that they were enlarged and changed to a slimy green color. The men came at her, and she spun around, slamming her tail against 3 of them and sending them flying backwards. She finally noticed that the fifth man had a camera pointed at her. She likely should have smashed it, but instead, she just ran. She ran to the river, leapt in, and swam at incredible speeds, before eventually growing very exhausted. She leapt herself out into a dark corner under a bridge and let herself fall asleep. When she awoke, she quickly found some garbage bags to conceal her mutated skin and tail and ran home to tell her father and sister what had happened. They were of course terrified at first upon seeing her, as her face and entire body were dramatically mutated, then devastated to hear of Namil's death, but soon they'd sadly find that neither of these occurrences were the last of their problems. On the news that day, a report came on every station of a so-called dangerous mutant that had attacked an innocent man, her brother. It was said that Roxxon employees had stepped in to try and save the boy, but she then assaulted them as well. Worse still, they claimed that analysis of the boy's body had shown that he may have survived the attack if it wasn't for a deadly virus that infected his body through the wounds she'd given him. They claimed that any who interacted with this so-called mutant would have to be isolated, as they could be infected with the virus that her body was the host of. Namju didn't know if the news had been paid off, or if Roxxon was simply that good at manipulating and covering their tracks, but either way, a city-wide hunt was started for Namju, exacerbated further still by the fact that South Korea had some months earlier been subject of an attack by the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. This, of course, caused much more public distrust of what she had been reported to be, a mutant, which was likely exactly what Roxxon had hoped for in claiming that she was one in the first place. But this also caused a slight stroke of luck in her favor. Because of the Brotherhood's attack, the X-Men of Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters in America, who often combated the Brotherhood in their misdeeds, were keeping a close eye on mutant relations in South Korea. They quickly caught wind of the story and came to find Namju, thinking her to be a mutant as the news had claimed. While they did soon discover this wasn't the case, they were still well willing to help her. Namju left her family, knowing they could be taken away for helping her, and came to Xavier's school, both to learn how to use her new powers and to use their resources to find a way to expose Roxxon, clear her name, and finish her brother's work. There are many groups and organizations working to keep the galaxy safe. Some are diligently run, such as the Nova Corps. Some are more of a ragtag group, such as the Guardians of the Galaxy. The Klown Korps, on the other hand, well, they're entirely another story. The Klown Korps were essentially made as an offshoot of the Nova Corps, created by a disgruntled ex-member called Klonzula, who thought he could tap more potential power through his Nova helmet. Normally, the Nova helmets allowed the wearer access to the Nova Force to gain strength. Klonzula, however, used a blend of science and magic to alter his helmet and have it pull power from another bizarre and unusual realm. It granted him more powers than the Nova Corps had, but they were unusual powers. As he made more of these helmets to grant to other wearers and build his own group, called the Klown Korps, he soon found that his new recruits were all getting randomized abilities from their helmets. Some could create shadow figures to attack foes with. Some could mentally manipulate targets. Some could even fire energy rays from their hands that turned their foes into a substance that very much resembled cotton candy. The attire that adorned them when they donned their helmets was also quite strange and tacky, and often came in a wide array of clashing colors. One unfortunately consistent trait of the Klown Korps was that they all had a weak point right in the front center of their helmets, around where their nose was located. A clean shot there could deactivate their connection to their power source. Even stranger still, if the helmets deemed the wearer unworthy of gaining the abilities of the other realm, they'd be turned into a pile of a substance that resembled Earth popcorn. All the same, the group carried out their work, traveling to different planets, looking for problems to solve. They gained more and more attention over time, and eventually had a run-in with the Guardians of the Galaxy. There was some tension between the groups, and though they did end up working together to some degree of success, the Corps would be thereafter dubbed the Klown Korps, as Star-Lord claimed they highly resembled Earth clowns, and very much enjoyed making fun of them due to this fact. Because of the fame and notoriety of the Guardians of the Galaxy, this name, unfortunately, caught on. Not long after, curiously enough, the Klown Korps would take on a task on Earth, where they would meet one of their next recruits, a high schooler named Shorty Chiodo, who had always wanted to be a superhero and didn't care where he got his powers from. He was granted a Klown Korps helmet and gained a myriad of abilities, but most notably became able to shoot his fists at a great distance as his arms would unravel into springs. Few would ever take this group very seriously as a peacekeeping organization, but the Klown Korps did gain a small cult following who greatly appreciated both their heroic efforts as well as their bizarre aesthetic. If you enjoyed this, I highly recommend checking out my famous video game characters as Spider-Man villains episode from a few weeks ago. Very similar concept to this one. And of course, I'd love more recommendations for other things I could do with horror movie characters this month, or other things I could turn into horror movie characters. Anything that you think might fit well into October. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today isn't so much a quote, just an idea that I try to think about anytime I find myself being judgmental of someone else or their actions. I always try to reverse it in onto myself and think, is what they're doing actually wrong, or is it just something that I'm not used to because of my perspective and my upbringing? And if I do still see it as something that's an immoral act, I can then just try and use it as a reminder to myself to not act the way they're acting. Other people acting in a way that you don't approve of, or even in a way that hurts you, can always be turned for the positive by just making it a lesson for yourself. Little different kind of ending note today, but I hope it's helpful to someone out there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.